latest. And so it gives our clients and our audience time to come and join us. This year, it had to be rescheduled twice. At one stage, it was clashing with the MTBPS, and I think what was not foreseen is that this week actually coincides with people coming from the investment forum, which took place, recently. So the other challenge, I think, is that the sponsors of the breakaway sessions, we are given about 10 tickets to give directly to our clients. So we rely on the summit to pull the crowds. Nonetheless, we are all here. It's a good conversation that we have selected, and we've got the right people in the room. So we can sort of think about this as a round table. Everyone participate. I'm going to introduce our panel. From the ABSA team, we have Tiens Elas, who heads our resource and project finance division. Next to Tiens, we have Alicia Kisa from TCTA. She's a senior project finance manager. On the other table, we have the Chief Financial Officer of Sanral, Inge Mulder. Next to Inge, it's Mohan. He's an executive for coverage at DBSA. And we have Monale, who is the head of the New Development Bank. Many people call it the BRICS Bank. So can we have a round of applause for welcome our panel? Okay, thank you. And I'm going to let our moderator, Tiens, to just introduce the topic. And I will encourage the audience to please participate as well. We have bankers in the room. We have representatives from the DFIs. We have representatives from the state-owned companies. And the conversation is really about, we know the challenges that our country is facing at the moment. We know that if we do not invest in key infrastructure projects, we are not going anywhere. And underpinning this conversation is where we see state-owned companies as catalysts for economic growth in our country. And a question came up to say, commercial banks, DFIs, and our clients have been having conversations for a long time to unlock projects, to find alternative, innovative ways of financing. But just somewhere the conversation gets lost. We talk, but we don't implement. And today's conversation is not meant to rehash what has been spoken about in the past, but it's really to try and elevate it, take it to another level. And when we leave this room, we have taken some notes and we've got a few pointers. We go to our offices and we start implementing. So let's participate and let's enjoy the conversation. I'm going to hand over to Tiens. Thank you.
Thanks, Bakang. Thanks for the opportunity given to ABSA to moderate this session. Infrastructure development is obviously key to Africa's largest development and economic growth, as Bakang was saying. And we continue to sort of look at ways to, at least from the financing community, to help our partners across various government entities, from national to provincial to SOEs to local municipalities, to help them to find ways to actually further develop infrastructure, and obviously the prime role is to help them with financing as well. And there are many sort of issues and stumbling blocks along the way, as I'm sure we will discuss now around the panel. But we also had a look at, more broader in Africa, how infrastructure is actually getting funded at the moment. And I think maybe that's not a bad starting point. The African Development Bank have done lots of studies, as did the World Bank, around the infrastructure financing gap, which they reckon is sitting at more or less $50 billion per annum. If you look at what's actually being spent, they come to around $75 billion per annum. But then more interestingly, we also had a look, and the African Development Bank report also sets out how the money is actually, where they actually source the money from. And interestingly, more than 50% of the $75 billion is basically sourced from normal government taxes, as it should be, and basically funded on a direct contracting basis by government. So this will be an SOE using its government allocations to basically pay for infrastructure and do the procurement directly as well. Then there's a further about 40%, and this is across Africa, where the funding is basically linked to a contract. And the guys who do this very well, for example, is the Chinese. So they will talk to a government centrally and say, ask them about their requirements. And in that, they will say, look, we'll build this bridge or this road for you, and we will also provide the financing. And typically, the export credit agencies play quite a big role. So a further 40% basically done on that sort of basis. And then there's a very small piece, around 10%, which is done through PPP or IPP type models, where they will identify a piece of infrastructure, agree that it will be done on a PPP type basis, and typically through a bot model, transfer the ownership to the private sector. And then the private sector will raise financing from commercial banks and DFIs. And for us, that's always been a very interesting space where we feel the DFIs and the commercial banks can play quite a big role in looking at that 10% piece. But more importantly, looking at ways to grow the 10% piece. Because within that PPP sort of bucket, typically also sits deals which could potentially be commercially viable standalone without massive additional government support. And for us, that clearly should be the focus, to have the projects which can pay for themselves, exactly do that, requiring limited or no additional government funding. And we've got a few very good examples of that in South Africa. Our toll roads, a good example. They basically pay for themselves. There's no government subsidies attached to them. You know, all the, and depending on the way you look at this, but all the renewable energy deals which have been procured raise the financing themselves, and the only obligation from government is to buy the power. So against that scene, I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists to see how they perceive this infrastructure gap and the challenges that they're facing in actually raising financing in the market. And also perhaps talk about the way they fund themselves, whether it's mainly through the government sources. You know, is a lot of the funding on the back of contractors actually coming to them and say they will provide the financing? And what do they see the prospects of the sort of third bucket, which could be PPP type deals in their sort of own institutions? So maybe if I can start with Alicia. Specifically, maybe give us a view from your perspective around the challenges which you are facing in actually raising financing, and where would you like to see this actually going?
Okay, good morning, everybody. My background is the water sector, and I think it would be out of place for me to try and answer that on behalf of all state-owned entities. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on water in our response. Now, water is an integrated type of resource. You know, the water starts in Lesotho and it goes all the way down until it ends up in the sea. And what we have is we've got 3 layers of government that plays a role in the same water that starts from the top that needs to end into somebody's tap and goes back into the resource. And we wouldn't be accurately reflecting the challenges of funding by generalizing it. I think that the challenges that are at a national level is very different to the funding challenges that is experienced by municipalities or water boards. So I do think when we talk about innovative solutions for funding, we need to go and not get a general solution to say the answer is PPPs. Because not everybody can manage that. Not everybody would find that as the solution. So my warning almost to the discussions is not to only go for one option as the answer to innovative funding. The problem that we experience is also not availability of funding. There's money everywhere. There's queues of people that actually want to fund water infrastructure in South Africa. The problem is to get all politicians, government officials, everybody aligned in terms of what is the priority. Which are the projects that we need to tackle, and we need to make sure that those are implemented. Now, because you've got various layers of government, you've got various layers of priorities. And we are not getting to the stage where we are prioritizing these water projects collectively so that we get all the energies and all the decision makers aligned.
Thanks. I don't think I can agree with you more. We understand that the presidential task team is in the process of exactly looking at that, which is basically through the structure, helping government to actually look at prioritizing the right type of deals, and then also look at options for actually procuring the deals and procuring the financing. But that's definitely a key issue. But moving over maybe more from water to roads, I'm keen to also get Inge's views from a SANRAL perspective, and maybe also touching on this very controversial user pay principle. Be keen to understand from their perspective their challenges and how, from their perspective, they actually like to see things happening.
Thanks, Jens. Good morning, I think, still. Yes, from a roads perspective, and even if you think not just nationally, you think about provincial and municipalities, I think Alicia's point in terms of the layers are different, and their challenges are definitely different. Also, we can also see that there's sufficient funding available. From a municipal and provincial side, they struggle because they don't have the technical expertise to do roads projects. And obviously, they have competing resources inside as well. So you're competing with hospitals and schools and all the other things there, which is an immediate requirement versus a road that can deteriorate over 10 years and then you have to rebuild it. And nobody thinks about that from the start. So the problems we've seen so far from a provincial and municipal thing is that they keep on building new, but they can't maintain what they have. So from a SANRAL perspective, we do the opposite. We preserve our assets first, and then we'll do expansion if there's money left over. So from the government grant that we get, we're only allowed to spend that on non-toll roads, so that's 86% of our business. So we spend what we get first on all the maintenance across the country. And then if there's any money left over, we do strengthening. So that's where you make the pavement last a bit longer. And if there's some money left over from that, you'll do some capacity increases. So you can see there's really no money left over for new development of roads. Now, our country doesn't necessarily need so much new roads. We've got I think the 9th highest coverage in the world of roads. So we've got sufficient number of roads. It's the quality of the roads that's the problem. So in South Africa, we've got 750,000 kilometers of roads, of which 120,000 is paved. So in order to maintain that number, 750,000 kilometers of roads across the country, it takes a lot of money. So if you think about SANRAL, which is only doing national roads, it's 22,000 kilometers, that's national roads. So 86% of the freight moves on that 22,000 kilometers. So that's your economic arteries of the country. And if you can't maintain and increase capacity on those, then the economy suffers. So from SANRAL's perspective, it's never been the money. So we do the toll roads, we get sufficient funding. We've always said, same as TCTA, there's sufficient money that can be invested in roads. But we struggle to roll out projects because of the political uncertainty. Now the policy is there. The policy says, the NDP says the user pay principle is a policy of government. But yet when, push comes to shove and you have to say, tolling is the user pay principle. It's the same thing. Then suddenly people start stepping back. So, and that's been the problem, that we've got about 150 billion rands of economic infrastructure that we need to roll out. And we get now, our government grant is 20 billion rand per year. So you can think, how long will it take us to build anything over that period in that group of 150 billion rands, when we still have to maintain what we have? So for us, that is a grave challenge. So we've asked several times now that we have a roads funding policy, which is a national thing for all roads, not just SANRAL roads, to say, okay, in this case, you use tax money. In this instance, you must use the user pay principle. And it should be fairly clear to say this is economic and this is social. But that, let's say the will is not there yet to tackle that thing head on, because it will require the public to be participating in that and agreeing to this is the way roads should be funded going forward. I don't know, Tians, if I'm answering. Treasury. So from our perspective, it's a funding issue. So the funding must be run by National Treasury. We can have a roads policy with DOT, where they do a roads plan, a 30-year roads plan, but funding is more a National Treasury competence. They must decide, okay, we're running this process, this is how we see, from a policy perspective, how we fund different infrastructure.
Thanks. Okay, it's working. I think maybe moving over to Mohan, I'm keen to understand from a DFI perspective, looking at what was now being said around government policy, where do we actually need to focus to unlock some of these deals? How do you see the role maybe of institutions like the DBSA in actually assisting our SOEs, but also assisting government potentially to unblock some of these issues, and also to sort of stimulate, and which is probably sitting at the heart of a development bank's mandate, to stimulate more infrastructure development. And how do you see your role in that exercise?
Yeah, thank you very much also, for the opportunity for the DBSA to be here as well and contribute. From our side, what we see is there is a role for us to provide long-term financing for the infrastructure, but it's also to put together the plans and policies in place, help coordinate that process that allows for the rollout of infrastructure across the different sectors we participate in. So whether in energy, transport, student housing, even in the health sectors as well, and water and sanitation in the municipal sectors. As an example, one of the things that we've seen is, if you look at the energy side in South Africa, it's generally recognized that the IPP program that we've had has overall been quite successful in bringing in a lot of new energy into the grid. I mean, I think starting with it was at a high cost, but if you look at the prices now, it's quite reasonable. And they're continuing to decline. And in reality, all of those projects have been delivered basically on time and on budget, right? And what that needed was a couple of different things, and we played one part along with National Treasury and the line ministry, in this case, the Department of Energy, in putting that together, which is, on the one hand, you have an integrated resource plan that at the time gave a 20-year view of the supply and demand for energy in the country. So anybody that wants to participate in that sector has a view of what is needed over a long term, because we'd all agree that infrastructure is a long-term game. The second part was then the IPP office that was set up, between National Treasury, but the DBSA provided at the time about 80 million rands to help capacitate that office. This was in 2010. And what that did was it allowed expert advice to come in, and effectively a very open and transparent procurement process of how the winners were going to be chosen. And it also, built in certainty around what exactly is the role of government in terms of providing guarantees. What is it that they're not going to guarantee? For instance, in which cases would those apply? What that then allowed is now over 80 projects, over 200 billion rands of capital expenditure into that sector, something like 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts of energy by the time all those projects come online, right? And now there's another, additional rounds. So if we take the lessons from that is, you need a long-term plan in a sector. And really, it's only the government that can put that in place, because it's really the role of government entities to agree on that plan. And one of the critical elements of that plan is this concept of prioritization, right? Are you going to prioritize, coal, nuclear, renewables, hydro? Where is the government going? And also giving a view of what is the demand. And then it's this transparent procurement process, because you need that to be able to then crowd in the private sector to come in and make the significant investments, not just in building, but even before building, just going through that whole tendering type process. Because, there's a lot of work that they need to do to figure out where are they going to build this, what is, for instance, the renewable, for instance, the irradiation or the wind flow. There's a lot of work, environmentals that they need to do, right? So they'll do that, and typically, the cost of that is estimated at around 5% of the capital cost of a project. They're going to do that if these things are in place. And we think our role as a DFI is to help replicate that. So if you took that lesson from that program and you take it to other programs, one of the areas we're trying to work on is around student housing. We know there's a massive gap around student housing. A lot of our students in tertiary educations are not living close to the universities, or where they are, they're really living in very, very poor accommodation. So thanks to the program now, where Treasury is allocating funding for poor and working class students to be able to access higher education, a portion of that is for accommodation and food. Now, what we're doing is working with National Treasury, the Department of Higher Education and Training, and the universities to put together a program that we're calling SHIP, which stands for Student Housing Infrastructure Program. And the DBSA is helping to kind of organize this along with those entities. And we think it's another example of replicating that. And I think we're trying to do the same for the provision of private hospitals as well. Because there's a lot of licenses. I was hearing at a panel that we sponsored that there's over 400 licenses for private hospitals that are out there. Now, not all of those are going to come to fruition, and all of those have basically been given to majority Black-owned entities. But many of them don't have the capital to bring those projects through to bankability. And most of those hospitals are in townships, they're in rural areas, peri-urban areas. So there's a program that we think is needed, working with the private sector as well, to put that together. So I think those are examples of what we can do.
Thanks. I think just looking back at the renewable energy program, at one stage it was, hailed as probably the best renewable energy program in the world. Even if you speak to some of our clients today, I think because of the transparency in selecting, winning bidders, and we know we had a bit of a hiccup before we got the last round of deals signed. But the way it was put together and looking at the interests both of government, ESCOM, and the private sector, absolutely fantastic. So I think what gives us, at least from a commercial bank, a lot of comfort is that that the plan is to actually roll that out across other sectors. And if the same level of diligence is applied in terms of the way the program is structured, getting the political will to do this up front and be very clear and transparent as to selecting the winning bidders, that only spells very good news. So, and for that, I think we can all commend the DBSA for instigating and kickstarting that process, and we absolutely look forward to similar programs. Just maybe moving over to Monale, I'm keen, and maybe around the same question, also to you. How do you see your role in also addressing these specific questions around assisting infrastructure development, in South Africa and really across the continent, and what would your role be in that?
Thanks, and good morning still to the audience. As a fairly new institution, there's quite a few I would say, experiences that we've already learned in that very short space of time. And I would like to agree with my fellow panelists that lack of financing is not a problem in the space of infrastructure. I think that has been exposed over and over. I think within this very same panel here, I think individually we have spoken about how, as a bank, as the NDB, we've got a will to offer them more funds over and above what we've already provided. And on the other side, they will express to you, of course, also that they've got a lineup of infrastructure that they would like to implement, and for some reason or the other, they're not able to. So something in the system is not working to ensure that capital is being facilitated from the lenders and to those that wish to borrow to implement infrastructure. Some of the obvious things that we've picked up that are perhaps on either regulation or the design of government and so forth, that we need to have some very serious conversations about. In my previous life, in government, there was what we referred to as a public sector borrowers forum. I wonder to what degree that still takes place, because I think it was a fantastic platform through which there can be an engagement between either borrowers on the one side and the policymakers central to issues of borrowing and infrastructure deployment and development. I think without those conversations, we miss a lot of opportunities, low-hanging fruit. And I'll expose in those areas of regulation and design of government. As a development institution, we are designed to be very simplistic in how we look at infrastructure. We are designed to also provide value add in the form of implementation support. If you think of government as a whole, where it lacks the most in terms of implementation is other municipalities, and Inge mentioned, and also at the provincial level. So it goes without saying that if you're a policymaker, you must find a way through which you can help institutions like ourselves, which you have helped set up, to easily facilitate the capital which you have contributed towards, for it to move to areas where it is needed, and also areas where there's capacity constraints. I'll use to illuminate an example of China and how China operates with IBRDA, the World Bank. They've got an allocation of about $5 billion that they can borrow from the World Bank every year. They borrow to the maximum. Not because they need the $5 billion, because if you get money from the MDB, it comes with implementation support. So once you take that money, then by design, you have borrowed implementation capacity. So what the Chinese will then do, will split it into small little bits and pieces, distribute it to municipalities and provinces, and there goes the World Bank going to help with implementation. It's a very same concept that as the NDB, we can easily assist on the ground here with regards to implementation. But the MFMA is designed to be a defensive policy. So it's designed to be a paranoia policy in that it assumes that everyone wants to steal. And even though there are good boys and girls in there, it stifles the degree to which they can assist. And once you begin to touch, and I'm saying this as though I've never worked for government, I've been on the other side, perhaps, maybe with my experience, I can say the things that I'm saying. But it's designed to make things complex for everyone. So it doesn't differentiate who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. And I think that's where policy conversations really need to be at. And it's to some degree, when you see what is happening in the presidency now, there's an element of an appreciation that something at the center is not working. And this is what links now to my second point, where we're talking about the design of government. The Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee was born, and it was placed in the Ministry of Economic Development. Now you tell me that where it was sitting, whether it was empowered enough to say if TCTA has got issues with either borrowing limits or guarantees, or is in disagreement with the water and sanitation about the degree to which they want infrastructure to be implemented, whether the PICC was empowered enough to call Treasury and call water and sanitation into the room and get them to find a compromise. No, it was not, because none of those would have pitched. So you need somewhere within the presidency a formation or at least an agency of sort that can help reconcile some of the outstanding issues. I mean, from transport to water, you name, to energy, there are projects that are stuck for one reason or the other. And because departments that are responsible, cross-cutting, operate in silos, and every one of each believes that their reason for not progressing the project is superior than the other, and there's no one in the middle who can call all to find a compromise. And that's where you find there's 4 trillion of projects as a wish list, and there's plenty of funding that is available that is not meeting the project. And of course, my last point on there would be that it gives rise to suboptimal responses. So I've already now indicated that there are funds in the system that are struggling to find projects. There's an infrastructure fund that's been born. Now, I'm not too sure what it's trying to address, and perhaps good things will come. But if I'm the NDB and I'm going to be called upon to deploy a rand into the infrastructure fund, it's going to be the very same rand that is struggling to find projects. Then you have to guarantee me that in the infrastructure fund, it is going to suddenly find projects. I'm not too sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I do agree with you, and not to be controversial, but our take is also that there's no lack of money. There's no lack of funding, either debt or equity, for the right type of deal. So if that's not the problem, I agree with you. The fund is not going to solve that. I agree. It's the same rand that's basically going to be looking at investing in the same project. But the other theme I picked up through the discussion, so if funding the money is not the problem, it looks like it's a political will and a prioritization issue. And our understanding is that this presidential team, with it's now been set up, supposedly will be looking at exactly prioritizing these deals, and hopefully through the political will make sure that our deals actually gets executed. But just back to maybe back to the water side. I mean, if funding is not the problem, I mean, what do we actually do then to solve this issue? I mean, what practically can we do? What can you do from your side first? I'm going to ask you first, and then I'm going to ask from a Sanral perspective as well. What can we do to change that mindset within government and make sure that the right deals actually do get prioritized and that they actually get to execution? And what can we, as maybe the financing community, the DFIs and the commercial banks, do to help in that process? Because ultimately, as South Africans, we're all in the same boat. We want to see these projects being developed. Our poor construction firms are taking very serious strain because there's just a lack of new development and construction. And that's probably at the heart of what we need in this country. We need to kickstart infrastructure development, which will hopefully also eventually land up in better GDP growth numbers. But what can we do?
I'm not sure if it's whether we can do it, but what is required is we, as the state-owned entity in the middle, has got government on the one side and we've got the funders on the other side, and you almost feel like a counselor. You're listening to this side, you're listening to that side, and you understand everybody's problem. But we have to sort out regulation and enforcement on revenue management. The user pay principle needs better political support. If you have your revenue management sorted out, you have the ability to raise loans and repay them. Funders are not going to throw money at a project if they're not sure that they're going to be repaid. Now, I do think when you sit now on the other side, if you look at government side, they want to transfer risk. And I think sometimes they get a little bit caught up in shying away from projects where they have to assume any type of risk as government. But they have to take risk. In terms of the Constitution, government needs to provide infrastructure. They cannot not make decisions to get projects implemented as though that is not a risk by itself. They're only quantifying the risk to to projects in terms of what it would cost them if this project would go ahead. But we don't see them doing the type of analysis to say, what would it cost me if this project is not implemented for the country in the next 5-year period? So if we on the one side, from the departmental side, can sort out regulation and enforcement and increase our revenue management, then a lot of this funding gap is actually disappearing. If we have the ability then to have a revenue stream, then we have the ability to go and raise loans and repay them. Then you come down to say, okay, if the money is there, the revenue stream is there, how do you mobilize the implementation? And I also don't think that there's a lack of capacity to be able to manage projects at a high level. I think it's when you start to go down in the structure in the water supply chain that there's real challenges with procurement and contract management. It's one thing to procure, it's another thing to manage that contractor over the period to get the value for the money that you are paying. And I do see that the DBSA is starting to come into that space and maybe provide assistance and to municipalities for procurement and contract management, and then the problem is largely solved, I think.
Inge, on your side, do you agree with that user pay principle? Surely you already mentioned.
Yeah, I think from our side, everything Alicia said is 100% spot on. It's so obvious. If there's no toll revenue, then you can't fund the project. So why is it that we get stuck on this thing? And our experience over time and spending lots of time with talking to people, talking to all kinds of different levels, it's really a lack of understanding. It's a lack of understanding of how big is the cake from your tax money, and what can that cake do and what can it not do. So what is outside of the cake has to be funded from a revenue that is not there, which is not tax. Now, and it's really an educational drive, roots up. And we've seen, the more we talk to people, the more they get this understanding of why do we toll 200 kilometers in Gauteng, when there's 6 million vehicles that travel in Gauteng and only 1.5 million is using that 201 kilometers. Why do we toll and not put a fuel levy on? And the moment you start explaining these things and people understand where it comes from, then it creates less of a political risk, because the political risk here is they don't want to do things that are unpopular, which is unfortunate, because if you want to be a leader, sometimes you'll have to make unpopular decisions. So for us, from our side, as a state-owned entity, we can educate to the extent that we can. But if it doesn't come from leadership also, you struggle, because SANRAL can't defend policy. That is not our role. We implement. We're an agent of government, we implement. But we can assist in education.
Yeah, I think quite well said. Maybe just back to Mohan. Is there anything the DBSA can do? I know, in terms of setting up things like the REAP program and with all the sort of rolling this out to other sectors, but it looks like at the heart of this is probably this user pay issue. And how do we, make sure that we actually get into government's face around? And I think Inge explained it quite well. The cake is only so big. And we all know with tax revenues sitting where it's sitting and government finances under pressure itself, that cake is probably getting smaller. And everything outside the cake is just not going to happen unless we convince someone to find another revenue source. How do we go about and what is it that we can do between the DFIs and the commercial banks to actually help drive that very critical discussion in government?
That is a very good question, because if you look back in South Africa about 10 years ago, right, we were in a situation where we had the debt capacity to basically use our own fiscus to then drive infrastructure growth. At the time, let's say the debt to GDP levels were closer to 25%. And so after the global financial crisis, South Africa invested well above the inflation rate, around 10% a year or more growth in funding going towards infrastructure. The challenge was almost all of that money was going through public entities, ESCOM, the municipalities, other state-owned entities. The issue was you can spend the money, but you may not get the outputs, as you're seeing with some of the power stations and certain other infrastructure as well. I mean, I think even with SANRAL, with the Gauteng infrastructure program, the freeway infrastructure program, part of the question was it simply the user pay principle, or was it the amount of money that was spent on that as well, versus perhaps the value that the people of Gauteng felt like they were getting for it? And I think that would be one of the questions. So, and if you look at ESCOM, for instance, we spend hundreds of billions of rands on the two power plants, and Medupi and Kusile, we're not getting the output. So where we are now as a country is this situation where we don't have that fiscal capacity anymore, right? I think, if you follow the 3-year forecast, our debt to GDP will be sitting at about 70%, which is a very high number, especially when you pay the levels of interest rates that we pay on our debt. So therefore, we do need to come up with these other mechanisms. But at the same time, I think we are also a highly taxed country. So I think that's where some of the pushback will be coming from the citizenry to say, we're paying all of these taxes, why aren't we getting the value that we want, including in infrastructure? So, I mean, to go back to a point that was made around how are we supporting there, one of the, the municipalities are probably our biggest set of clients. If you just look at the amount of money that we spend on lending and all of the non-lending support that we provide. And what we try and do, especially for the mid-size and smaller municipalities, is to work through the infrastructure value chain in helping them. So for instance, part of it is right now, there's a team within the DBSA that's working in 5 provinces with the provincial COCTAs to set up a project management unit to help prioritize the infrastructure in those 5 provinces. We provide long-term planning support on a grant basis for municipalities to make sure that they've got long-term plans in place in the key sectors that they want to deploy their infrastructure. We provide project preparation support, again, often on a grant basis or on a recoverable basis, if and when the project gets built, to make sure that individual projects that come out of that planning phase are planned properly. They're using the right technology, they're being put in the right space, all of those kinds of things. And then post the financing, which obviously we'd also like to be able to provide, we also provide the implementation, monitoring, and support areas as well. And I think which Monale had referred to in the Chinese example as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing to try and make sure that the tens of billions of rands that municipalities spend of our money as taxpayers and citizens are being used correctly. But I mean, the one thing that we haven't engaged with, is around trying to push even further the user pay principle. But maybe that is something, we need to work with the state-owned entities around, especially in key sectors, and say, in these sectors, this is a principle that we need to drive, and we have a role to play as a nationally owned financier in promoting that. To be honest, we haven't pushed that as heavily maybe as we should be.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, I agree fully. There's perhaps maybe 1 or 2 other points that will support or add in some way or the other, and picking up directly on the project preparation element or technical assistance that emerges also out of the conversation. There's a low level of investment with seed capital that also stifles the throughput of infrastructure to bankability. And what the government has committed in recent times, which is a very small sum, about 500 million or so, which is going to be managed at the DBSA.
And over 3 years.
Even worse, right? I think it just highlights the degree, to which we are still going to struggle if we don't have conversations about scale. And I would use an example of the 100 billion fund that has been set up in rand terms. That it is known that you need to be deploying about 10% project preparation. So on the 100 billion, 10 billion should be set aside for for PrEP. If you're talking about this 500 million over 3 years, is far less than what is required. That is the type of conversation that we at least are having with government. You were asking earlier about what types of conversations, so we don't end up sinking into despair that there are no solutions. We're having those conversations, and we understand that there are fiscal constraints, but this will require some rebalancing act in some way or the other within the fiscus. If in fact the headline that South Africa wants to drive is that of infrastructure development, then the decisions that are made by politicians will have to reflect that in fact that is the case, and money will have to be set aside. As we hear a lot of times, when there's pressure on the fiscus for one reason or the other, money is found, right? When SAA is in crisis, money suddenly emerges. When ESCOM is in crisis, money emerges. When so-and-so is in crisis, we are in crisis of infrastructure, money must also emerge to reflect that there's a crisis going on. So I think that's the type of conversation that we, at least from our part, as I say, that's the angle that we're taking in the conversations with various politicians. With regards to user pay, and I'm going there without invitation. You see, I mean, in my assessment, it's really, the matter here fundamentally is about policy certainty. If you're saying user must pay, and then you flip around, then the users becomes tentative and they stop paying, right? If you say the taxpayer is going to pay in some way or the other, those are one and the same. So you need some sort of. So the fundamental issue also here, as Mohan has said, is whether the infrastructure that you are investing in is productive. So if I am government and I'm borrowing through the roof, I'm borrowing at 8% or 9%, but my nominal GDP is growing at 12%, then I've got no issue because then GDP is growing and my revenue is growing fast enough to service debt. So debt to GDP ratio of 60%, 80%, 100%, or 50% or 150% becomes really immaterial. So then going back to really how these projects are prepared, how Kusile and Medupi don't become Kusile and Medupi, that so many years, so much debt that has been borrowed has not rendered itself productive enough to pay back the debt, is a fundamental problem. So all this is the universe through which at least our contribution through the forums that have been established with the new political regime or in the presidency, so to speak. That's our input, and hopefully that will become to change the narrative. But it will take time. Of course, these things will always take time to turn around.
Thanks. So it seems that in addition to user pay and politics, is also should be a key focus on actual implementation and making sure we complete projects on time, on budget, and that they are actually being used productively, which I suppose goes to the execution and maybe capacity within government to do that. Look, I'm going to pause the panel discussion and I'm going to give a few minutes for questions from the audience. We've got a very highly esteemed panel here, so if anyone has got specific questions for any of the panelists, please ask them now.
Thank you. I'm CJ Venter from Biggin Group. We are in the infrastructure development space, and I appreciate the discussion and the comments. Certainly some of the issues that we are also experiencing, and specifically regarding the discussion on the user pay principle, where does the money come to repay? And I think that's the big discussion here as well. And I think that some of the questions that we are maybe not asking is, who are the users? How do we define the users? Within the IPPs, it was fairly easy. There was one off-taker, so that's one user, and we can determine the credit worthiness of that user. But I think like in the water sector, there's a wide variety of users, from our indigent communities right up to industry. And how do we then fund a project if our users have got a wide variety of ability to pay, from zero to afford? And that comes back to the project preparation, is how do we structure those projects if we've got a wide variety of users, we've got a wide variety of funders, even represented within the panel, from commercial to a state-owned entity with its own balance sheet, and a DFI that has also got different risk appetites. So if we could structure a project around what is the off-taker profile and what is the risk appetite of the funders, we could come up with a blend of funding that we can match with that. But that takes significant effort, and we are under-investing at the moment within that. So it's maybe a statement or a question, but it comes back to the last comment made as well, that bigger focus is needed in that arena. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take one more if there is a question.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Mulder, you've spoken about in large, what the conversations that you're having with government. I'm just wondering, in light of governance issues that we have seen in state-owned companies, to what extent, are those challenges, make you unwilling to lend to SOEs, and what kind of discussions are you having? Thank you.
Okay, if there isn't any more, maybe I can just also throw in a question there. From what Monale, you are saying, it sounds like the conversations are happening at the right level with the new administration. You alluded to forums that you are participating in. So the question is there perhaps a room for commercial banks, for other, and maybe state-owned companies to also join in and help, just improve on the voice and on the discussions that are happening at the table at that level? Because one of the things that I'm taking out as I'm listening is there isn't a lack of funding, there is appetite, but it almost sounds like if the SOC is the one that's talking to government, then the perception is you're advancing a certain agenda because you want a certain outcome. If the commercial banks alone are talking to government, also there's an issue of maybe trust in inverted commas, if I may call it that. And the DFIs are also in the picture. So it's about who actually is the one that should be talking to government and making sure that the way they understand and they see things is exactly the way, that the lenders who have the funds want the message, to get to government. So just a question around, is there room for us to join? Maybe you can also reflect on the statement that was made there.
Okay, I'll attempt to just respond to the two that are directed at me, and the other one can then float. On governance, I mean, maybe just a little bit of background on why the NDB is the NDB, and it has been born in the way that it was born. And it was not to try and reproduce the so-called Bretton Woods systems. In fact, it was started on the basis that an institution must be set up to become what the World Bank is not, and many others in that stable. For reasons being that those institutions have tended to impose conditionalities over countries that were problematic, and many countries still to date struggle in some way or the other to either use the funds or to repay that which was historically lended. So as a starting point was to try then to make it as easy as possible for countries, and I would say countries still obviously emphasis on the 5 members with plans to expand. So the 2 main pillars there would be that we use country systems. We use country systems, and there is there's equity in terms of there's no member that's got veto power over the other, which is complete disconnect from the traditional MDBs. So on governance, we tend to take also a very constructive and pragmatic view on things. The stance that we are taking on South Africa is that it is going through a reform process. So we're taking a longer term view. So we are able to deal with ESCOM with an understanding that there's a reform process and there's a cleanup that is underway. At Transnet also, we take the very same view. So institutions differ. Sanral, we take a view that the policy issues will resolve themselves, and hence you're able to pick up in the headlines that we are talking to them and we want to give them more. So that's the longer term. Whereas other institutions would be very much still dwelling in the presence. And that has been, in a way, a key defining tool between us and many other institutions that may have struggled in some way or the other. So what role would the commercial banks and maybe other institutions play? I mean, just the efforts at DBSA at the moment on Project PrEP and also Infrastructure Fund were born out of a process which included banks. So just to take you back maybe a year ago, where the CEO initiative came together with Treasury, came together with ASISA and a few institutions. And the question that was on the table was that there's issues with infrastructure broadly, infrastructure implementation and financing, be it looking at from different angle, the PrEP and availability of capital and what could potentially be done. And the recommendations that came out of there that a project preparation fund must be set up. And there's been draft documentation that went in about how various players. So what you see now is a culmination of that process. Be it there's only one contributor so far that has put in the funds because the rules are not yet fully completed. So we were expected to contribute. DBSA was expected to contribute, and the commercial banks were expected to contribute. But commercial banks, with regards to seed capital for Project PrEP, it's always a bit of a struggle on how they interface. But there's an expectation that that very same process, that document, is going to give rise to everyone bringing something to the table. So the decision was made to plug it at the DBSA, given that they already have an institutional framework, or the plumbing already exists. So it's just a natural place for it to be plugged there. So when that moment comes when you're going to be approached directly, and it's a good thing that the question came from you, so a head will come to you to say, what is your... Because to be fair, Mohan, the banks benefit a lot in many of these transactions, be it from different deals, teams that are either restructuring one aspect or the other, or they're dealing with the FX issues. There's a big participation of the banks, and I think it's fair that they also get involved at the beginning of the processes.
Maybe just on that as well, even the project preparation fund, we haven't received the funding from Treasury. We've actually put our own money into the preparation funding. On top of the preparation funding we already do, we've allocated more capital. While we know those funds will come through at some point, there's discussions and such, because we don't want the projects to lag behind. So what we've done is actually put our own additional capital into that project preparation fund. But as has been identified, whether you use 5% of capex or 10% of capex, if you need the hundreds of billions, South Africa spends about 6 to 8% of GDP on infrastructure every year. If you say our GDP is 5 trillion, 6% is 300 billion. 5% of that is 15 billion rands in project preparation that's needed. Nobody has that kind of a balance sheet. We're talking hundreds of millions, not in 10 billion plus. So, it is an issue. But traditionally also, we have to give credit. The SOCs, like, the ones that are here, have invested their own capital. They do their own preparation work as well. It's not just as if that they don't do that. I do want to go on the governance issues. We take the governance issues very, very seriously. And it's something that even our shareholder, National Treasury, has asked us to do, which is when we provide funding for municipalities, for SOEs, we need to do the work to ensure that actually projects are there to be funded and that they do come through. And we do that also in the work that we do outside of South Africa. So I think there was this quote, which is trust but verify. And one of the things we do is, even when we do balance sheet lending to an entity, we want to see the use of proceeds. That we do want to make sure that our funding is going towards real projects, and that we have the ability. So before they start, we send a due diligence team to make sure that there are projects in place, that the work has been done, and post-fact to be able to go and review those projects as well to ensure that our money has been spent towards those projects as well. Because the reality is, as much as we trust the right things are happening at ESCOM, Transnet, or whatever other entities, when the money was lent to ESCOM in 2010 and before, these issues of governance weren't there before, right? Similarly with Transnet. So it could be said of the DBSA as well. So, whoever is providing the money does need to see the use of proceeds to ensure that, there is going to be value realized through that. I think maybe I'll come back later after this on the issues that CJ raised from the Begin group as well.
So let's just get Alicia a chance to speak specifically on the question around who the user is, because water is so fragmented. You don't sit like with renewables where ESCOM is the off-taker, or with Tara.
Users need to pay. Now you're sitting with a situation where people call things unaffordable. But it's actually a willingness to pay. Because how can you say you cannot pay for water if you have a cell phone and DSTV? It's a willingness. And what we see from users is they so much want to negotiate and be consulted and want to have a say in what infrastructure needs to be built, who should be paying, what happens that eventually none of this infrastructure is happening. And where you have a minister that is the custodian of water in the country, the minister cannot get past the users that feel that things are unfair. So you sit with an emotional user base that so much want to make sure they get the best deal that they negotiate themselves out of having water resources. And where you have the same sector for 15 years negotiating and being consulted, and there's a dam, but the water does not get anywhere, then the users also need to look at themselves and say, okay, what was my contribution in these things not happening? So the user pay principle is there. It will have to be there. You only have 3 revenue streams or streams of cash. The one is somebody's giving you money, and that is what we have from the fiscus. The fiscus can make certain contributions. The other one is you need to sell your product. In the case of water, we're not selling, we're providing the water, and the users pay. That's a revenue stream. The other one is loans. But loans are not grants. Loans need to be repaid. So the users need to understand that where you are going for a funding solution where debt is involved, you need to have the debt repayment ability, and the users will be asked to repay that. So from an affordability issue versus willingness to pay, the users would also have to look at themselves. It's very easy to always throw these things that government needs to, government needs to, government needs to. But on the other side is also the users. And then one thing that from the funders, to answer what is it that the funders can do, the funders must just also listen to what the sector, that specific sector is requiring. Don't come with one solution. There's flavor of the month in banks, and I don't know who decides on that. At a stage, it was capital markets and market making. Then it was ECAs, and now it's called PPPs. You can't have one solution. You can't decide what is the flavor of the month in terms of the funding solutions for the sector out there. And then the PPPs from National Treasury, if this message can get to them, let's look at the PPP model, but resize and reshape it for each sector. You can't have one PPP model that will work in education the same as what it will work for water. You can't have the same PPP working for roads than you will have for the health sector. So they would have to review and refine their PPP model for smaller, fit for use for municipalities equally to national government.
You get a sense it's well resourced, that
Question.
People get stuck on one structure. And we're sitting in these rooms and we call it innovative. What is innovative if you stick to what you have? It's not innovation. So we need to get to the point where we say, yes, this is the ideal of what a PPP should look like. But we're not in an ideal situation in South Africa throughout the water supply chain specifically. I don't know. I can't speak for other sectors.
I do want to come in on this user principles, right? Because my feeling now, not as a banker, but let's talk about this from a citizen who has to pay. I'm comfortable paying for a cell phone because I'm getting a service, right? And I can go to Vodacom, I can go to MTN, whatever. The problem with SOCs is there's only one person, you know. Eskom doesn't want us to put up solar PV panels and get our own electricity. Right now, the regulation is that up to 1 megawatt, you can do that. But above 1 megawatt, there's huge regulatory uncertainty. So we as individuals can do it, but if you're now a mine and you want to put up a 60, 80, 100 megawatt, you know, solution, which could be cheaper than what you get from Eskom, you can't do that. So even the SOCs say, we want user pays, but guess what? We want you to pay us, the SOCs. Not necessarily that we want to really allow that choice. And what we want to be able to do as a DFI is to drive that choice. Through regulation, allow people, if we can generate our own electricity, let's generate. Now, it may not be the case with roads and water, right? And so it doesn't necessarily apply. So, but what I am saying is, it goes beyond that as well, which is how do we then really crowd in these kinds of other solutions as well to give our citizenry the choice, that they need.
Thanks. Inge, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the obvious is in roads, in transport in general, there's a pricing issue. I think you've mentioned now water, but pricing transport is also something that needs to be explored. So whether you use a bus, a train, or a bicycle, or a whatever, there's a cost in transport. So what is your pricing for each person may be different. And I think what the user pay principle assists with is that, for instance, your comment just now, the user pay principle gives the user the opportunity to pay directly for the service that he uses. Whereas if you pay tax, you don't see that service. So if I was a user, I would insist on paying directly for everything that I use, as opposed to paying tax. But of course, we have to do the social infrastructure. And I think that is the line where we have to see, okay, and be clear about, be transparent. Sorry, this part of your tax that you're paying is to assist poor people. This part is what you need to pay for what you use. Your road in front of your house, your water, your electricity, whatever the case may be. And I think that is it's a little bit of a developed discussion to have. And like I said earlier, in terms of your education of people, it is something that you need to drive for people to understand, why do I now have to pay for a road that was there before? And why do you think it was too expensive when we have enough proof to show you that it was the least expensive in the world? So it's an educational program that we have to go through to get through pricing, and so that people understand the transparency of what we're doing.
Perfect. Thanks. Let's conclude there. Maybe one or two final comments from my side. It looks like it's not only government or the funders or the SOEs that need to do some introspection. I think even us as citizens, as we sometimes get very vocal about exactly this very same user pay issue. But it also seems that, and maybe as a takeaway, worthwhile that we maybe set up a joint discussion with relevant people in government, at least, and from a commercial bank perspective, we would love to be part of those discussions, to, like we've done in this sort of forum, debate some of these issues and see if there's not more that we can do to get their understanding also going around, how do we fix this problem if the cake is only this big? How do we actually conclude and how do we actually implement more with what we've got? And this whole issue about prioritizing and maybe sifting through projects which may well be fully bankable and get those actually done, and then leave the more difficult stuff for the more difficult political discussions. So maybe with Steve's help or with colleagues around the table, it would be very useful if we can maybe set up a similar sort of, maybe just a roundtable discussion with relevant people in government. Because I think from a citizen perspective, we would love to see more infrastructure development. Ultimately, hopefully, it will also result in us paying less taxes if there's more user pay principles coming out. But obviously, from a South African perspective, we want to see growth. We want to see people getting employed. And this is an area where we can really drive those agendas for the country. So again, I just want to thank the panelists and thank the audience as well for sitting and listening. And hopefully it was an insightful discussion. Thanks a lot.
So I think just from the ABSA team, we'd like to thank you, the audience. I know when we started, it was a bit shaky, but we are very happy, with the turnout, given the circumstances. And to our panel, they gave this discussion their all, as if the room is full. Can we give them a round of applause? And we also, I think, just quickly to appreciate our EXCO member and head of public sector and growth at ABSA, Steve Siaka. If you can shake. So just for, for always looking out for opportunities, for ABSA to play a role and participate in key discussions, matters of national importance, and for sponsoring this. Thanks, Steve. So we have a little gift for each of our panel members. Thank you for honoring us, and thank you really for participating. Thank you.
Is it under 500 rands?
Sorry, I'm not being quick, but I was a no gift policy, so I can't accept. I'm sorry. Thank you.